Welcome to the church library. Draw up a chair and join us as we sort through these stacks of old books. I'm Marissa Burt.
And I'm Kelsey McGinnis. And here in the church library, we host conversations about popular Christian books. This season, we are dusting off Christian parenting resources.
Our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families, examines many of these books, the obscure, the bestsellers, the ones that still pop up in church parenting classes.
Let's see what's on the bookshelves today. I'm Marissa.
Hi, Kelsey. Happy July. Here we are in the church library again.
Happy July. That feels really weird. I really wish it wasn't July,
right?
Actually, right now.
We are fully in the summer now.
No, I know. No, I'm looking at my calendar and completely panicking. So let's pretend it's still June for a couple more days, please. Thank you for joining us, listeners. We're really glad you're here with us today. We are joined today by Sunita Theiss, a fellow writer who explores parenting and neurodiversity and disability. She has a fantastic Substack where she writes about all these things that we will link in the show notes. She's written for Christianity Today, Business Insider, and other outlets, and does a ton of really amazing advocacy work. So thank you so much for joining us, Sunita.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're so glad you're here. And as you know, we're focusing on Christian parenting teaching and books this season in the church library. So I'm wondering if you could tell people listening a little bit about your story, about your own experience with Christian parenting advice, whatever you'd like to share as by way of introduction.
Sure. I am an autistic and ADHD mom of neurodivergent kids who share those and other diagnoses. I wasn't diagnosed until adulthood myself, which I would say honestly brought a mix of clarity and relief and grief. For much of my early parenting journey, I think I was working from advice that didn't really see me or my kids. I didn't grow up in Christian spaces. I grew up Hindu and I became a Christian in my 20s, though I explored Christianity and other faith experiences throughout my teens and early adulthood. I'm raising my kids Christian now. And even so, I think being South Asian and in immigrant communities, there's a lot of emphasis around authority, certain types of success, academic performance, etc. And after I became a Christian, I was in a church that I think modeled a variety of parenting styles, but I think I absorbed a lot of stereotypically conservative and traditional messaging around parenting and discipline and authority. And so as a new parent, I tried to force those approaches, and often to the detriment of my connection with my older kiddo. And unfortunately, I would say probably to his emotional well-being sometimes, which I've learned a lot about since. And I would say, as I've learned a lot about neurodiversity specifically and like neurodiversity informed parenting, and then in the context of my faith, I think about God's gentleness, about God's heart for his children, that started to shift. And so I think just over the course of clarifying my neurotype, my kids' neurotypes, unlearning shame-based models, learning to parent in a way that I think better reflects grace in that relationship.
Well, we have been wanting to talk with you for a long time because one of the questions that we get most often is how does neurodivergence show up in Christian parenting resources? And you touched on this a bit in your answer or in your introduction to yourself. And a lot of the time we are sort of stuck telling people, historically, these books have done a really terrible job of even acknowledging neurodiversity in the church.
Yeah.
In some cases, like the earlier books that we look at in the 1970s, the language around those things was so different. Someone like James Dobson, who was, trained as a psychologist, will kind of nod to the existence of autism, but it's in a very limited, small box, very this is an extreme, very rare thing, which, funny enough, we still see people talk about autism that way now. RFK Jr. recently made comments like that. It sort of puts
Right.
this extreme category. So for that reason, and a number of other reasons, we sometimes feel a little bit stuck when people ask, well, my children are neurodivergent, or and my community doesn't have anything that sees them or acknowledges them. Where can I go? What resources can I find? And I'm curious about what your experience has been as a parent looking for resources like that, and why you think that that problem is there, and what do you see any movement in a new direction?
So first I'll say, and this is basically like what you all talk about all the time, is that most mainstream parenting resources have historically centered a specific type of kid, right? Like a compliant verbal kid who is either able to self-regulate or is able to suppress their emotions so that they come across as good and compliant, and assumes that good parenting or a specific type of parenting will then produce a good child or good behavior, right? So if it's extremely formulaic, like you do X and you will then achieve a certain output Y in parenting. Neurodivergent kids generally defy that formula, because it assumes a neurotype, and sometimes I think they're shame or fear-based models. And so they're compliance-based models. I would say most compliance-based models are shame and fear-based. And so I don't know, you guys should probably answer this better. I don't know that that's all Dobson-based, but like a lot of that comes out of, I think, the sort of secular stuff too that was coming out of how parenting was taught. And like I did like a deep dive. This is like maybe a special interest I had for a while. Like you go back to like the Industrial Revolution and sort of like the way work was shifting out of the homes, and people were moving into cities, and parents had to leave their children in the care of other people. The way families existed in community was changing. The way societies were shifting. You had to cry it out models of like all of that was changing. And so parenting had to change. And so like discipline had to change. And so that's one piece. And like also assuming that like kids are not doing their best when they aren't complying, and therefore they're not obeying, and then like sort of backing that into scripture is sort of how I experienced it as someone who came into the faith as an adult, who didn't have kids and who didn't grow up in church. And so as I was visiting churches and trying to figure it out in my 20s, because I didn't have that context of growing up in church, that's what it would look like to me, not knowing I was autistic either, and like seeing kids melting down, and having my own experience of childhood where like I knew I was just having a hard time. And so if a kid is melting down because of sensory overload or executive dysfunction, or like their socks don't feel right on their toes, but people think they're being bad. Like it's not willful defiance. Like their nervous system is just having a hard time, and they can't communicate that to you. And you're assuming it's like a sin problem, but it's really just like the seam of their socks on their toes. Like now you've got like a huge mismatch and a misalignment. And now they're thinking like there's something wrong with them spiritually, but really they just need like a different brand of like footwear. Right? Like,
Right.
And like, and then you think about like downstream, a decade into the future, when like the problem in their life is relational or sexual, like someone has taken advantage of them in high school or college, and they can't come to you. And like, and like that's extreme, right? But it's not, because like I hear of things like that happening. And like, because connection is ruptured and safety is ruptured in the place that is supposed to be safest. And so like, I don't want that to sound extreme, but it is urgent if you're not caring, because neurodivergent children are extremely vulnerable to those types of things. And so I think like that's one thing. And that speaks to, because like there's a conflation of behavior with morality. And when you're spiritualizing, like deeply spiritualizing shame for kids who just can't meet our expectations, it requires I think, like more theological nuance, and it requires more compassion. It requires more willingness to listen to neurodivergent and disabled voices in our spiritual communities, including parents who are neurodivergent and disabled. So I sort of answered one of your questions, I think, with all of that. So yeah, I feel like neurodivergent kids have been ignored by parenting resources. I will say there are more neurodivergent voices in Christian spaces now, disabled voices in Christian communities now, than there were 20 and 30 years ago. Overwhelmingly, they tend to be men, I think, where when they talk about parenting, they're not talking about it as the primary thing that they're talking about, but if they are fathers, there are, I think in the next few years, I've seen announcements that books are coming out by moms about their experiences of motherhood. A book that I have been recommending, and generally like a social media account, I recommend the Ericksons a lot, Flourishing Homes and Family. It's because they have neurodivergent kids, or a kid, at least one of their kids is. So they're not, they have recently done a course about neurodivergent kids, but even if they're not explicitly talking about parenting neurodivergent kids, they are coming from that lens. Their stuff is biblical and science informed too. So I will point people to them all day long, forever.
Yeah, and they have a relatively new book. I guess it's been out for about a year, called The Flourishing Family. And I think
they have
they're
a
doing a
workbook that just
right?
came out or is about to come out. And they just did a course online about parenting neurodivergent kids.
Yeah.
And so I would expect more to come from them on that.
And it really spotlights, I think, some of the things you're saying, the way that what we practice day in and day out is what shapes a pattern. So no one can predict what will happen down the road, but certainly if people are not given any opportunity, if parents don't have the skills or tools to practice, how do I see this child's needs? How do I even identify what's going on? Like even any element of that,
right?
It will just not be there day in, day out, and will form the relationship. And we hear that from a number of people as well, because a lot of Christian parents are just getting the only tool is to escalate the shame and fear and punishment if they're not getting compliance. So I've heard from a number of adults who were diagnosed late in life who then connect dots of like, why was I spanked significantly more than my siblings, or different things like this, where they're connecting these dots and saying like, oh, that was the only tool my parents had and implemented, and really destructive impact. And yeah, I think I resonate with what you're saying about like, I think we're about to hear more from people. There's more people talking about this. There's more awareness, but it ripples out because similarly in church communities, this is a pretty relatively recent conversation as well, as far as how do we welcome people with disabilities, families with neurodivergent children. How do we welcome them into church structures that are similarly modeled of people will know what to do and know how to do this. Children will sit in Sunday school and listen to a lesson, and et cetera, et cetera. So what has been your experience with what this looks like in churches or children's ministries? And do you have thoughts on how that's changing, or things that make you hopeful, or anything in that arena?
Yeah. I've been, I think, uniquely privileged that we have attended churches that have overwhelmingly been willing to work with us and accommodate us. We've had tricky experiences with other church members from time to time, but the leadership at our churches has always been inclined to and wanting to make us feel welcome and to go way out of their way to let us know. Like we had an experience when like my daughter was like maybe like 8 weeks old and my son we were as like a lessons and carols service, so like they're reading a ton of scripture, they're singing hymns, and my son is like maybe 4 and he just wants to sing Jingle Bells, and someone turns around and is like, maybe you should leave. And because I was like trying to quiet him and he's like, I don't want to be quiet, I don't want to. And I'm just like, we're sitting in the back, which I have a lot of thoughts about people with children feeling like they have no choice but to sit in the back anyway, right? Because kids should be at the front, they should want to participate, especially in a service like that where like the whole life of the service is happening in the front. They should want to see what's happening. It's a very reverent experience, and we should be okay with kids being in church. And someone turns around and says, maybe you should leave. And I'm like, my daughter was a preemie. So at 8 weeks, that means like she would have only been like a week or 2 old if I had made it to full term anyway. And so I'm just like a ball of hormones. And so I just start sobbing. We leave, and our church has there's a bunch of older ladies on our hospitality team. So they like surround us. They hand my son a big piece of cake. They, and the next day, the lead pastor at our church texts me and is like, I found out what happened. Apparently one of these ladies had told him what happened. And he's like, you are always welcome at our church. I'm so sorry that happened to you. Like we were pretty new to that church. It had been less than a year. And, so it's like, we've had really beautiful experiences like that again and again and again. That's not true for most families who have, where someone has a disability or someone is neurodivergent. I think overwhelmingly the statistics reflect that, like, they feel excluded. They just stop going. And at the same time, I can't remember, I get them confused if it was like Crossway or Life. One of the survey people, someone did a survey that says like something in the 90s percentage of churches feel like they are welcoming to families with disabilities.
Oh, interesting.
97%, 95%. That like they feel like they create spaces that are welcoming. And yet that's not reflected when you interview families with disabilities. And so, but our experience has been an exception, right? Overwhelmingly, it reflects that churches generally are places that prioritize order, control, conformity. But that's pretty inaccessible, right? Like you want to be able to move your body. If you're putting all of your effort into sitting still, you're actually missing the gospel lesson. You're missing what is being told to you about the love of Christ, right? Like you're missing the point. If you're focused on sitting still, then you're not actually learning. And a couple people I would recommend who I think are doing a good job of talking about this in churches. Kim Botto had a book come out last year. She's a mom of neurodivergent and adopted and has adopted kids too. And she trains kids ministries on how to make their like programs more inclusive. And she's a great follow on social media too. And like, I love everything she's saying and putting out there. Sandra Peoples just had a book come out like 2 days ago as well about making churches more inclusive. She had a sibling with a disability and one of her sons is autistic as well. And I think what they both do a really good job of is like, to cultivate belonging, you have to plan for the people being there. And it's not about like creating a separate space and saying, y'all go over there. It's saying like, we want to figure out a way to make a space so that you can participate with us. So I think they like, both of their books are books that have come out in the last year. Kim takes a pretty trauma-informed approach too. Um, so those are like tangible things. If people are listening to your podcast and they want something that they can like hand to a pastor at their church.
Yeah, and we'll look up those handles and link them in the show
Yeah,
notes.
yeah, and I can send them to you too. But so yeah, those are both things that I can think of. Key Ministry is like a ministry that also like can provide resources to churches that I got to go to their conference earlier this year and gave a small talk about like being a late diagnosed adult and like what churches can do to support people like me, because we're often getting diagnosed alongside our kids.
Yeah.
And they're really good at supporting churches that are trying to be more inclusive as well.
Oh, that's great.
But yeah, I think, there's a lot of expectations around sitting still, eye contact, instant obedience, that are just misaligned with how like neurodivergent brains and bodies function. And so, I would say though, if you look at scripture, I think Jesus is prioritizing relationship over rule keeping, rule following, especially when it comes to kids and those who are marginalized. And so, I think emphasizing grace over rules, connection over compliance, right? I think is going to go really far.
Yeah. Well, and it makes me think of the exhortations, the epistles to consider the needs of others, to
Right.
bear one another's burdens in this sense. And it's interesting, both in parenting and in even the anecdote you shared in church life, that sometimes when we lean into order and rules, it requires less maturity in ourselves as far as the people who that comes easy for, whether that's the parent who's in authority or the person in the pew who's like, you should leave because my experience is being disturbed or something, rather than these opportunities that could cultivate compassion, patience, long suffering. These are opportunities for the fruit of the Spirit to be formed in us. But a lot of times we have models that mirror more of what's just going on in the world, or like a consumer mindset that's like, this should happen. This should be an experience that is about my enjoyment of it as an individual. So, there's a lot to consider there of how this could be an invitation for families and entire communities to come to maturity in a different way together. Not so much like, oh, well, that's not my family's experience, so that's their experience, and maybe we want to accommodate that, but that's still pretty arm's length, rather than saying, oh, this could be transformative work. This could be something that's transforming an entire culture of a church. So thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
And I think one thing, I've talked to you before about this, Sunita, for an article that I'm hoping is going to come out soon. It was a while ago now, but every time I have conversations with parents of neurodivergent children or neurodivergent adults who are thinking about church life, I write so much about worship practices and like the ways that services are put together. That's like a regular beat of mine. And when I talk about this in that context, the way these things intersect, some things that come up often, I feel like these conversations are really helping to lay bare some of the shortcomings of how we think about what a service is for, what a Sunday morning is for, because a couple things tend to come up. One, you either get kind of like in the space that sounds like you're in, that's a bit more liturgical, like a carols and stories kind of, that kind of service that is a bit more structured, hymnody, those kinds of things, where there's kind of a high value on sitting still. People who plan those will talk about it being like a valuable discipline to like teach children to sit. This is a thing that children should learn to. There's been historically really high value on that. I can think of many stories that I've heard people tell either in like fiction about like the value.
It shows up in novels a lot.
It shows up in novels all the time.
Yeah.
This idea that this is part of the practice of becoming a Christian, someone who is practicing sitting still and listening, is a very important like spiritual virtue to make your children learn to do. There's that. But then on the more like kind of megachurch non-denominational side that I also cover a lot, these kind of bigger churches that have these big productions. A lot of people who work in these churches talk a lot about the excellence of a Sunday morning, like an excellent service with the worship set is now, the expectation is that it's kind of seamless. Everything is strung together. The songs lead one into another. It feels very much like, you know, a concert where things are orchestrated. There are bumper videos in between things so that there's no dead space. There's no silence. There's such a high value on what I would call the worship experience of a Sunday morning. And so the people who turned to you and said, maybe you should leave, this is impacting my experience, right? Like this is it messing up the experience for everybody else. Because I don't actually think what they mean is you are hindering my ability to worship. You are hindering my ability to learn. Right? Like that's totally assuming that the way I relate to you and your kids is not part of my learning, is not part of my worship. Like my worship is the thing that I'm supposed to do when I'm facing the front and participating in the program that is being presented to me. But when you start opening this conversation about how many people that can marginalize or exclude or really not minister to, you start to realize that like, I'm not sure we all are thinking about Sunday morning in that connected way, that you're this sort of relational way.
Right.
And I find myself like struck by that because I've spent so much time in this space. And now I'm realizing like, oh, this is like potentially hindering some real connection between people.
Well, it's fascinating to me too, because when I think about as someone who like my sort of journey to Christianity was that in high school, you know, my rebellion was like, sure, I grew up Hindu, like sort of, and then I dabbled in, you know, partying and doing whatever, but then I was also like invited to church by pastors' kids, and I went mostly to make my parents mad. Right. Like
it's your rebellion.
Yeah. So like, and then I had like this big like waterfall like experience and like Wednesday night youth group. And someone like handed me a Bible and I said a sinner's prayer, and like I went a few times, but then it was just like hard to be there and be like without my parents. So then like I just went back to partying and like having my family chaos. And then in my early 20s, after my dad passed away, I had this like sort of immense grief. And I remember praying sort of half-heartedly, like, God, if you're real, like now's a good time. And I had moved out of my mom's house and I was in college, and I had found the Bible and all that stuff from that night in college or in high school. And I was looking at this Bible and these cards of these like very well-meaning like teenagers in youth group, you know, who are like, we're so excited for what God is going to do in your life kind of stuff, you know, and like this like little pamphlet that was like, my heart, God's home, and like, you know, stuff that people give you. And I was like, God, if you're real, like now's good, because I'm just sort of at the lowest point in my life. And like really cool stuff happened. Like God did show up, and I have been a Christian pretty much ever since. Right. And I was 21 when that happened. And because I don't really care if people know how old I am. I'm 37 now. Right. And so like that was almost 16 years, that was almost 17 years ago. And I say that to say like, I've sort of observed worship at a lot of different seasons of my life, and I've observed worship in a lot of different traditions. Right, I've been to Orthodox and Catholic churches. I've been to Vineyard churches. I've been to mega churches. I go to a relatively smaller like Anglican church now. I've been to big like multi-site mega churches, and I've been to small rural spaces and in different languages. I for a season went to a bilingual church where they alternated English and Spanish every other song. Like I've seen a lot of different worship experiences, and all I want from my kids is to know that this is reverent, and this is meant to sort of be one part of your experience, like furthering your desire to to connect with God. And so when someone turns around and says, maybe you should leave, what I'm hearing is, I don't care that you and your children draw closer to God, especially because we are in a liturgical tradition that believes that what's happening up front is sacred and holy in a way that other traditions who don't have sacraments, right? Like, and so, so that, it's like there's a many layered thing about the value of children, about the value, and like, and I'm assuming they don't know my kids are autistic. And at the time, I didn't know my daughter was autistic, right? Like, she was 8 weeks old, and but there's now with my kids, like my daughter's a little bit older now. When she was like 1 or 2, we had the Stations of the Cross up in the sanctuary. I would just walk her around, and we would look at them, and she would touch them, and I'm sure someone was upset that she was touching them. Right? But what she knows is that's Jesus, and this is the story of Jesus. And we're walking through, and it's like, that should be a reverent experience too.
Yeah.
And I think the thing I love about like going to really, really high church liturgical experience is that it is a multi-sensory experience, right? You are smelling, you are standing, you're using your voice, you're getting up, you're sitting, getting down. Like, some Orthodox churches don't even have chairs. You're standing the whole time, and then you're kneeling, and like, there's incense, and but for some neurodivergent people, the incense would be too much. And so I think you have to consider that everyone, if there are chairs, they're in the back, and they're reserved for usually the elderly who can't stand. And so, to tie it back to sort of what we've been talking about throughout the thread about like neurodivergence, is like, we are accommodating people at all times, right? Like, we can accommodate the elderly, we can accommodate the hard of hearing, we can accommodate people who can't smell incense, but children are a sticking point.
Yeah. And I kind of, tell me what you guys think about this. I kind of suspect it's also triggering for the people in that environment. Like, I think there's a sense of like, oh, this is disruptive, but kind of in the same way that parenting can be really triggering, right? Like, if an adult grew up in a home where it was like instant obedience is paramount, then when their child doesn't obey instantly, it's almost like this impulsive reaction. And I kind of wonder if some of that is going on too, where people are like, no, you can't do that, or you will get, it's like triggering to see. And maybe this is me reading my own experience. I remember it. Oh gosh, it brings it back in early days of church planting. So this is probably about 15 years ago or so, little church plant. And I remember in the little group, there was a mom who's a good friend of mine now. But they were pretty new to the church, I think, and had a little, maybe infant in arms. And they were sitting right behind a very elderly couple. It was like this combo. And the infant toddler somewhere in there was just loud, the whole, kind of ongoing. And I remember it produced such internal anxiety in me, even though it didn't really have anything to do with me. It wasn't like my child, and I remember, I think at the time I went over and was like, can I help you? I can hold her in the back or something, which I should go back and talk to her and be like, what was that like for you? Because it's that sense I think sometimes people have of like, oh no, what's happening to everyone else's experience, or they're just deeply triggered by like, this isn't permitted, which again, I think comes back to those high expectations messaging they've received along the way of like, that is not permissible. We need to stop that. So it's almost this impulsive, we need to shut that down immediately. Because maybe these spaces aren't genuinely accommodating. And that ties into what you were saying, Kelsey. I think that maybe along the way, there's not been space to say, what are we really trying to do here? Because if we're really trying to do a seamless experience that doesn't have interruptions, or are we really trying to do something that's just really quiet? Like, is that really what we want? Do we want like a lecture that's really quiet? Then it is going to produce those sort of things. So I think there needs to be in my experience at least, a lot of intentionality in communicating in multiple ways. Not only is this like a collective project that we're invested in, like people aren't going to get in trouble for being noisy here, or, like to everyone, not just the people who might be noisy, but to the others, like this is part of our DNA, but also that meaningfully accommodates, exactly as you said, that says like, oh, there is a place where children can be loud and aged people can hear, like both can happen in this space because we see the actual, maybe it goes back to what we talked about parenting a lot. We see the actual people in front of us and are thinking about their particular needs, not some abstract ideal. But yeah.
I think there's a fear that if we make accommodations, we are like compromising truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that like, and I don't know if this is like a sort of a warping of theology, like colliding with reality somehow, but like what I see in scripture is Jesus adjusting how he engaged with people based on their needs. Like he wouldn't treat a child the way he treated a grieving parent, the way he treated a Pharisee, right? Like, but we can be consistent in our values. We can be consistent in being kind, being respectful, being honest, and also not be rigid in our behaviors, not be black and white in our thinking in such a way that like we're not leaving neurodivergent children, for example, feeling like failures. We can be gentle and patient, like, right? Like we can model the fruits of the Spirit in a way that helps our kids develop them and extend those towards them, but also like be accommodating. We're not, it's like accommodation isn't favoritism, right? It's I think if we do it correctly as the church, it's a reflection of God's heart for his people. It's a meeting people where they are. And I think I don't know how that got lost in translation along the way, but it has somehow. And I think you're right that it is like it's triggering people's fears that like we're gonna be like we're showing favoritism or we're not treating everyone equally. If we like if I let your kid have a fidget, then everybody's gonna want a fidget. Right? Like that's something like I think Kim Botto, I heard her talk about that like in a talk, and she's like, so let everyone have fidgets, like what's the yeah. Like, or like if she may not have said exactly that way, but like, so what's the problem if like if it helps all the kids have some kind of accommodation, then like figure out what everyone needs. Or if like a child needs a specific fidget, like there's a difference between a recreational need and a regulation need too for a child. And I think like you can have that nuance. There's a difference between requiring something for like a support and like something being a play item. And like I think people get stuck on like, well, if he gets one, everyone's gonna want one. Or like offering something as an incentive versus like a support item. Like I wear contacts and or glasses depending on the day, right? And like, but you wouldn't withhold my glasses until I finished my schoolwork, right? Like, because I couldn't see to do my schoolwork. So like, why would I withhold like a sensory support for my child until they finish their schoolwork? Because they need the sensory support to do their schoolwork. And so I think like it's just changing the way we think about it and seeing it as like a way to be kind, a way to be consistent in our values. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. I mean, I think it's right that there is this like, well, if we let one person do this, everyone's going to do it. Or like, if we make space for one person to be loud, then everyone's going to be loud. There's this like weird kind of all or not, like it's going to be one thing or it's going to be another thing. It's either or, like either everyone is yelling or everyone is silent. And I just think like, that's just not how communities are. Like, and when you know the children in the community, they want to belong. They want to feel safe. Like there's this like, I think there's this really insidious assumption there, especially when we're talking about neurodivergent children, that they are choosing to do, they're like being defiant. They're trying to assert themselves like I think there's just some real clear misunderstanding of what's happening. And I think this shows up both in how we think about churches, but also just parenting resources in general, how conversation about obedience and compliance shapes up. And yeah, I went back and as I was kind of preparing for this conversation and was looking at a resource that was talking about, well, there is such a thing as autism, but like, be careful, like don't like allow that reality to like let you think that you can give disobedience a pass, right? Like children need to comply. And that's like an extra hurdle that you as a parent maybe need to overcome, but God will help you overcome it. There's this kind of lip service to like, yeah, but no potential challenge is so great that you should ever stop requiring obedience of your children. That there is like underneath it, there is some shortcoming of theirs that they can and need to overcome. And I wonder if you would mind just kind of speaking to like how your knowledge of neurodivergence and child behavior ought to complicate that way of thinking about obedience for parents.
Yeah. I'm still processing that, I think. Well,
while you're processing, it comes up. There was a resource I remember reading that even like this, I think it's Ginger Hubbard, who was like, even if your child's sick, like you spank because God doesn't give us a pass for obedience when we're sick, kind of thing. So I think it applies to physical needs as well as any kind of, it doesn't matter, basically. It's just one size fits all. It doesn't matter. You need to obey no matter what.
Yeah, I mean it's like what I said before, like accommodations aren't favoritism. Like I want to just like paint that on a banner and just wave it across America in front of every church.
Make bracelets.
Yeah. Yeah, let's make bracelets. Let's pass it on to this group. No, but I mean, so Ross Green is a psychologist who notably works with kids that get flagged as difficult and challenging. And to my knowledge, he's not a Christian, but I actually don't know what he believes. But he always says that kids do well if they can, and if they're not doing well, it's likely because they lack skills or support. And I would probably add like safety, felt safety in there. And so if a kid's not complying, I'm using air quotes because people aren't going to see my face. They're not complying. If they're not doing well by whatever standard the arbiters of what well is supposed to look like have determined is well, it's because they need help. And we, as the adults in the room with the fully developed frontal lobes, are supposed to help them. I heard on a podcast a long time ago, probably not a long time. I mean, what is time? Early last year sometime, that it's our job to be our kids' frontal lobes, right? This is especially true of neurodivergent kids if there's executive functioning challenges at play. If we also have ADHD as parents, God help us. But like, you can't expect a child who does not have a fully developed brain to execute on skills that they do not have yet. Yeah. And we cannot then attribute the lack of those skills to sin and then punish them. Mm-hmm. That is silly. That's just silly. And then we can't spank them because our brains don't register the difference between spanking and trauma. Mm-hmm. Like we now know that's true. I will point people to the Ericksons. They've done a really good job of taking that research, the science, and then connecting that to scripture too. And so if your kid's having a hard time, they're not doing it because they want you to suffer as their parents. They're doing it because they need your help. And so identify if it's a lack of support or a lack of skills or a lack of safety, or if they're sick, and then help them.
Yeah.
That's it. Like that, like, and if they're neurodivergent, it's probably some combination of all of the above, and they're probably going to need a longer launch pad than their neurotypical peers. And buckle in, mom and dad, because that's your job. That's what God called you to. That is your vocational calling as parents, is that's what shepherding your children is. That's what stewardship is supposed to be, is to take the children that God gave you and help them through this world. It's not to spank them into it. It's, it's to say, I'm here. I'm going to hold your hand with gentleness and patience, because those are two of the fruits of the Spirit, and help you develop those same skills and extend those qualities to you along the way, because modeling them is one of the key ways to help you develop them. And focus on my own regulation such that you can learn to develop it. And if I can't help you do it, I'm going to go find the experts who can. And bonus, find autistic and ADHD adults along the way, and other neurodivergent adults, because those are not the only two types of neurodivergence, who can also teach you that it's okay to have those diagnoses, and it's not a bad thing. Because that's really important. Because from when my son found out that I also was autistic, it was just awesome. Because that was just like, oh yeah, cool, all of us are. It's like such a normal thing in our house. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as you're describing that, I'm just like, I'm sad because you have so much language for responding to behavior that's hard to manage it just is that there is behavior that is hard to manage as an adult, that it's just difficult. And a lot of Christian parenting books, the response that they give parents is one that's born out of, it's hard because it's sin, and here is a way to correct it. It's like, it feels very proactive because you can take action grounded in this kind of righteous anger about what your child is doing. And you can sort of put the label of sin on it, and even manipulation sometimes, the EZOs, there are resources that talk about infants even manipulating parents. And I think about parents who had to kind of go through parenting young children with only that kind of a toolbox, as opposed to any other mitigating strategy to connect or de-escalate or build skills. Not every child has a skill gap when it comes to coming into the world, right? It's not, and I think the language that has been developed in order to help parents parent neurodivergent children, a lot of it, I just think, wow, the language of skill building is something that every parent, Christian parents included, should have access to. But so often that's sort of bypassed in favor of probe the depths of your child's heart and figure out what the sin issue is so that you can act accordingly. And so it's a combination of, wow, this is so refreshing, but also wow, I'm so sad that has not been there.
Yeah, there's such an impoverished view. Even what you were saying, Sunita, about the frontal lobe and things like this, just there's such a dearth of even lip service to child development. And so I think parents are really only given that sin language to fill in any blanks. So it's a looking at infants, toddlers, every stage of childhood, and seeing some perspective of a miniature adult, and whatever that looks like for the parent. And I was thinking about this just yesterday because we were telling family stories, with some of our older children. And we were talking about one who was so young. He's very verbal. And I can remember him at 15, 16 months trying to recount something he had seen. And we have it on video. It's so cute. It's just gasping and then one word, but he's over and over retelling the story. And I was just thinking of how, not just how vulnerable, but how like you said, Kelsey, they all need to build skills. Like to look at a 16-month-old, who is barely piecing together language or is trying to figure out how to communicate an idea with enthusiasm. And as a parent to say that's willful defiance, that's a threat to me or God, is just a bananas leap to make. And I know it's throughout all these resources, but I think if we as parents could take a step back and be like, really? Are we really thinking this is the mechanism of what's going on behind these people in formation, the newest people who are still developing in significant ways, and think the worst of them and the cruelest of them and the most malicious intentions of them? It's a stunning betrayal that I think also really reveals a lot of contempt for ourselves and others at the heart of it, which is tragic for Christians in particular who believe this radical message that God loves people, loves people, knows them inside and out, knows them from the womb and loves them. And I don't know, I was struck afresh by that, thinking back to how intense those early parenting years are. So it makes sense that parents can feel like they feel under it. They feel overwhelmed, that they feel like this child is my adversary somehow. But how that really robs a lot from families. That is not the fruit of the Spirit, to look at the children entrusted to our care and see them as our adversaries.
It's so interesting to me that you say that and maybe it's because I struggled so much with infertility, or maybe because I didn't grow up in church, but like when I had my kids, especially my first, because it was such a journey to get pregnant. And then even between my kids, like there were miscarriages and there was all this stuff, like, and I'm sorry if I get emotional, like to look at my kid, like, and to experience this like outflow of love and just to hold this baby that was so prayed for and so desired, I was like, oh, God loves me, like, and I'm only experiencing a fraction of this deep affection. That's what it means that God is a good father. That I'm sitting here and I am, and also like when my kids do like just the dumbest stuff, like when they're getting into antics and they're getting frustrated and they're like we have PDA is like pathological demand avoidance is this, it's not in the DSM, it's this like sort of often considered like a profile of autism, and that's controversial, and I'm not going to get in the weeds about it, but it's frequently like considered like just like an overactive fight or flight response. It's a nervous system response. And so, I've sort of realized I have it. My kids, at least one of my kids does, probably both. And so there's these just like disproportionate, like highly anxious, sometimes violent lashing out responses. And like to understand that is happening because my kid feels viscerally unsafe. And to not also get dysregulated myself, but to go, oh, I just need to like sit with you in this because your brain feels threatened by what's happening in the world, especially when like, there were speech delays and like there was like lashing out, like, and then to go, God is capable of so much more when I feel unsafe. And I am lashing out and I'm going like, God, why? Why is this happening in my life? Why is this awful, horrible thing happening to me right now? And so like when I'm hearing you say parents feel like upset or threatened or just right, like when that's a hard season, I'm thinking about those. It was exhausting. I had postpartum depression, but I also just like my kid is what like helped me better grasp that idea of God as Father, because I became a Christian in my adulthood.
Right. And I think you're so right of like the theology, because just yesterday I was reading the Gary Ezzo stuff where he points to Christ on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? And says this is like kind of an exemplary moment of the Father not intervening right away. And he uses this as a justification for cry it out, abandoning infants to cry, to sleep train them. And I think at the core, there is this deep disbelief that God loves us and is coming for us and can be with us in the hard moment. Like you're beautifully describing, Sunita, like it's hard and I'm here. Like I do think the catechesis many parents and children receive is the opposite of that. It's that God has abandoned you. You're on your own and get it together. Please behave, and he's still going to be a little bit disappointed, a little bit angry. And that is never theoretical. I think it really shapes in the outflow, and then parents are often explicitly taught to override their intuition that you've described so beautifully, these instincts that come from biologically hardwired to love and protect and care for, and they're told, no, that's being soft. You should be suspicious of that and really need to crack down. And it's so, there's so much. One of the things we include in our book, and hopefully as a pre-order resource too, is a green light metric for readers that helps people to kind of identify green light things for resources or teachers they could follow. And I'm curious for you, what elements of a parenting resource or church community would be green lights for you, especially as the parent of neurodivergent children, especially as a person who is neurodivergent yourself?
Okay, I'll start with parenting resources. I think any book that encourages a parent to be a student of their children. So any book that is like prioritizing knowing your kid versus just enforcing a behavior. So prioritizing curiosity over control would be a green light for me. So kind of in that same vein that like allows room for a diversity of neurotype or development or emotional expression. So if there anything that says a one size fits all solution is not a green light.
Yeah, it's a red light.
Red light. So specifically, I mentioned PDA, so a clear awareness of power dynamics would be useful for me. Respect for children as image bearers when it comes to Christian contexts, and a final thought on parenting resources, authors who don't rely on fear, whether that's like fear of rebellion, fear of cultural decline, fear of getting it wrong, but instead are pointing towards love as a driving force in parenting. And then for church communities, I would say churches that ask questions versus assuming answers or making assumptions about what kids need in order to participate. Leadership that is willing to listen to disabled voices and involve them in shaping programs rather than speaking about disabled voices. Communities that embrace flexibility, whether that's sensory-friendly services or a sensory room. For example, visual schedules, fidgets in kids' ministries. If they have headphones available, like noise canceling headphones, or they have hearing amplification for people who are hard of hearing. Do they have other accessibility like things in mind? Small things that just say that they're just thinking about these types of things will make a big impact. Generally though, like just people who aren't going to be shocked by struggle, who don't need you to be like neat and tidy to be faithful, who are just willing to be in the mess with you. I think that can look different from community to community, but I think it will be apparent. So.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Sunita, in the church library today. Can you tell our listeners where the best place to find your work is? And also if you have any, upcoming things we should be watching for?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Sunita Theiss on Instagram. My website is sunitatheiss.com, which has all the assorted links. I'm also on Substack, although I've been writing pretty infrequently. I do have a workshop coming up about PDA, which I mentioned. If people want, the link is on my website. I set up a code for your listeners and I've now forgotten what it was, but I will send it to you to put in your show notes.
We will put it in the show notes. Absolutely.
So to give people a discount. And then if people want to connect on like a more one-on-one level, I also do some parent coaching, and that's linked in on my Instagram as well. So yeah, I'd love to connect if people want to reach out.
Yeah.
Awesome. This was a really fun conversation. We could have probably kept on going for a while. There's just so much to talk about. And we probably could have just gone through like our horror story, like just like all the terrible stuff we encountered in our resources that I'm sure would just make you, we just send your blood pressure through the roof, but
Yes.
we'll save that for another conversation, I suppose. So thank you, listeners, for joining us here in the church library. Always good to talk with you, Marissa.
You too. It was great. Thank you.
All right. See you next time.
We are so glad you've joined us in the church library today. This is Marissa Franksbert
and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And if you liked what you heard here, we think you'll be interested in reading our forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families.
You can pre-order it now wherever books are sold, and it'll be on shelves in October of 2025.